The purpose of this video is to introduce you to the process of nominalisation, which is a language-based process in order to improve the quality of writing. Let's look into it a bit more. So first and foremost, the process of nominalisation is all about converting verbs within a sentence to nouns. Now the reason we do this is to make the relationship between the information clearer within a sentence, and you'll see examples of that later in this video. Ultimately, the reason we do this is to make our writing more written and professional. In order to understand this process, first we need to recognise the difference between a noun and a verb. So let's look at a couple of examples. The word contain is a verb. It's something that you can do. So you might find this in a sentence. We can contain the problem. In this case, it's in its verb form. But every word in some way or other has a noun form. And you can see that across the screen here. The word containment is the name of that action. So we would call that a noun. Similar example, the word reduce. I could say you need to reduce the amount of waste that you're creating, or you need to reduce the amount of time that you're wasting. The noun version of that is reduction. Okay, so that's the name of that action. If you are reducing something, then you are creating a reduction. Okay, so there's a real difference between the nouns and the verbs. But it's not always as clear cut as that. Think about a word like punch. You know, if you punch something or if you jump over something, there isn't a word like punchin or punchment in the same way that there was for contain and reduce. In this case, when there isn't a particular word to describe the action, the noun form of that word would be to put it in this context of saying the punching of. Now this sounds really weird, and the big thing behind this is that we're talking about the difference between traditionally written language versus spoken language. And the reason this sounds so weird when I say it is because we don't speak like this. But grammatically speaking, the noun form would usually be more appropriate. But what we'll soon find out is that nominalisation is not an exact science. Let's look at a couple of other examples before we move on. He destroyed the city. So in this case, I've put together a really simple sentence here using the word destroyed as the key verb. So what would this look like if I nominalised that word and changed it into its noun form? Well, you can see in this case it becomes his destruction of the city. Okay, now an interesting thing in this case, and something you might notice, is that where he destroyed the city was its own sentence, when I say his destruction of the city, it's no longer a sentence, and instead it forms what's called a noun group. What that means is that I can actually add additional information to this sentence to show the relationship of what the destruction of the city actually created. Another way I could put it is I could say the city's destruction, just showing how nominalisation isn't an exact science. Both his destruction of the city and the city's destruction are nominalised versions of the original sentence. Sometimes it can be even trickier because a word like being afraid doesn't have a noun verb, like for example, afraidment or afraidtion. These aren't words that exist. So sometimes we have to find a word that's similar or best describes that. In this case, the word we're really talking about is the word fear. So you can see Mike was afraid was the original version, but here I'm saying the fear of Mike, or Mike's fear. Now, as opposed to the last example where we were talking about the destruction of the city, in this case, the second option of saying Mike's fear is a better option, because if I were to say the fear of Mike, then my reader might get the impression that we are afraid of Mike, when actually it's Mike who owns the fear. Okay, so sometimes language can be a bit tricky and you really have to make that decision about what's going to be best. Just to take you through a couple of quick examples of what noun versions might look like. Believe would become belief, intrude becomes intrusion, imitate becomes imitation, refuse becomes refusal. But the word isn't always clear. If you're hurt or if somebody hurts somebody, we might be talking about an injury. If you're saying talking, you know, this person was talking, or talking to me will result in that kind of thing, you might actually be talking more broadly about this idea of communication. Communication is a noun that we use which encapsulates a whole range of different ways, including talking to get your point across. If someone is killed, and this sounds a bit morbid, but if someone is killed, we might be talking about death. You know, so rather than saying he was killed, we might say it led to the death of that person. Okay, so just to show that language isn't an exact science, and sometimes the word that you think might be in place doesn't work, so you need to think a bit more creatively. Let's now look at this in a sentence form. I've got a simple sentence up the top here. If we contain the problem, we can reduce the effect. Okay, so in this case, I've got two verbs present, and I used these earlier on, so hopefully you can spot them, but the words are contain and reduce. So at the moment, this sentence is not nominalized because we're communicating with largely verbs. Okay, what I want to do is change these verbs to nouns and show the relationship between them. So here we go. So contain, as we know, becomes containment. So contain the problem would become the containment of the problem. Reduce the effect, which is its current form, would become a reduction of the effect. All right, so now what I have is two separate nouns, the containment of the problem and a reduction of the effect. And I need to join them together. That's where I call on what's called an is substitute. Now this is a word that links together two related nouns to show a distinct relationship. You need to use verbs in sentences. Nominalization doesn't mean getting rid of all verbs. What it means is creating clearer relationships between things, and that's what the is substitute does. So we're looking at verbs here, but we're looking to show what if we do this thing, what is going to be the result, or how is that result of the second noun going to come across? You can see a whole bunch of examples here. Caused, resulted in, determined, revealed, produced, led to, facilitated, fostered, and I can tell you there are hundreds more. You can also change the tense of these. Rather than saying caused, you might say will cause, which puts it in a future context. Or you might say causes, which puts it in a present tense. So you can change these things around. In this case, I want to pick an appropriate word to really show the relationship between these two things. So here's what I've got. Our containment of the problem. Notice I've changed the to our by putting us in it a little bit more. Our containment of the problem could lead to a reduction in the effect. Okay, so you notice I took led to and I added it to could lead to. All right, so I've highlighted those sections. Now this might sound a little bit funny, but ultimately what I've done is I've made the writing come across more professional and more clear. And that's what it's really all about. It's about showing a greater relationship between information in order to increase clarity. Now this is just one sentence. Let me just finish here by showing you a larger text to really give you a sense of how this works. So here I've taken a section from a formal essay that was written by a student. What I've done is I've highlighted all of the nouns present. Something that you'll notice in this case is that I don't always use a noun. Sometimes there's still verbs present, and that is more than fine. But what I think you'll notice is that the relationship and the feel and flow of this information is much more formal. So you can see here breakfast, which is a noun, leads to the improvement of academic performance. Okay, so this student has tied together these two nouns and showed their relationship. One causes the other. The consumption of breakfast influences better test results, improves grades, and increases concentration in the classroom. Now notice how there are verbs present in this, in saying improves, influences, and increases. But in this case, what those are doing is they're acting as is substitutes. They're linking together these different nouns to show how they are related to this one noun at the beginning, the consumption of breakfast. A study by the University of Florida reported that, now here you can see adolescents is a noun who ingest breakfast. So ingest breakfast is still a verb, and that is fine because it is not about overcrowding your language with nominalization. It's about having a bit of tact and thinking about it. But adolescents who ingest breakfast have higher test scores, superior concentration, and higher school and class attendance. Okay, so what they've done is they've basically said that this particular thing, adolescents who ingest breakfast, which in itself is a bit of a noun group, results in higher test scores, superior concentration, and higher school and class attendance. So they've showed that really strong relationship, and ultimately, that's what's going to make the that's really what's going to make this thing sound more professional and better. So hopefully you can see this process in action. It's complicated, but you can see it here. So a summary, just to take you out, nominalization is the process of converting verbs within a text to nouns. It's created to to make clearer and stronger relationships between information. It is not an exact science. There isn't always one answer. You can nominalize things differently depending on how you think it should sound or how it should work. It doesn't always have to be used. Not every verb in a paragraph or sentence needs to be nominalized. As we know, verbs play an important function, but when it's well used, it makes writing appear more written and much more professional. Hopefully this has given you a good summary of the skill set and you can put it to use in your own writing.